Good evening, everybody. My name is AJ Tornator. I work at MIT Libraries. Welcome to the Nexus at MIT Libraries for the screening of Citizenfour, a 2014 documentary directed by Laura Poitras. This screening is supported by the Shas Teams grant that provides the funding for the license of the film and also pizza in the back, so please help yourselves to that one. This documentary will be introduced by two MIT scholars, and I have the honor of introducing them to you. On my right, Mariel Garcia-Montes, who is a PhD candidate in history, anthropology, and science, technology, and society, the STS program at MIT. Her dissertation focuses on the 20th and 21st century trajectories of surveillance technologies in Mexico. She worked as a digital security trainer with journalists and activists in Mexico at the time Snowden blew the whistle on the NSA's Prism program. On my left is Michelle Spektor, who is a postdoctoral associate at the social and ethical responsibilities of computing, at SERC program at the College of Computing, where she directs the new SERC Learning Lab program. Her research focuses on the global history of biometric surveillance and its social and political implications. At the time that Snowden blew the whistle on the NSA Prism program, Michelle worked for the US government as a researcher for a bioethics advisory commission. It's a complicated documentary, and the director is also very much part of the directory, and we appreciate both Mariel and Michelle to do a little introduction for us here. So welcome, and thank you both.
Thank you, Jay.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to see this important film, which came out just about a decade ago, but remains important till today. And before we get started with our introductory remarks and the start of the film screening, I just want to see by maybe we can start with a show of hands. How many people in the room have heard of Edward Snowden? That's just about everybody, right?
Which is very different from what we had expected, thinking of the MIT audience that were maybe 5 years old or younger when these, whistleblowing happened. And we have seen in our classrooms that for some people, Snowden is someone that they heard of in the dining room in their home many years ago, but they don't quite know what was the deal. So something that was a very big event in our lives for a lot of MIT students is not, because they were very, very young when this all happened.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, in fact, just a bit earlier today, we were speaking with some MIT first and second years who had, I think only one of them in the room had heard of Edward Snowden. So we're really pleased to be able to share the documentary with the community.
And one more question, who here has watched Citizenfour already? Just Eric, who wants to rewatch it because of its present day relevance. But okay, so this is a new film to a lot of people. Citizenfour is a documentary about Edward Snowden's whistleblowing in 2013. And so the gist of it is that he discovered, or he was the one to blow the whistle on the secret program of the US government called, well, especially of the NSA, that was called Prism. And the oversimplification of this program was that the government had direct access to company servers of big technology companies. So Google, Yahoo, any big provider of your email or any communications channels that you might use through your phone or your computer, the NSA had a backdoor into it and had privileged access to be able to run searches on it. So as in a way to enact its mass surveillance program. At the time, there was a lot of controversy around this because, a lot of people felt that this was a very, big breach in the relationship between the government and the people, where, and also a breach between the service providers and the people, where people had a reasonable expectation of privacy when they were sending an email, when they were sending a photograph. And then the government, in its turn, decided to create these backdoors, these access to data that people presume to be private. And so this had like a very big impact in the public opinion at the time. And as a result of the Snowden revelations, a lot of change happened in the tech world. Encryption, end-to-end encryption, became the standard for most private communications in Google. Gmail got almost immediately, I think within 6 months of the revelations, Google finally implemented end-to-end encryption on its email services, which advocates that the Electronic Frontier Foundation had been demanding for years and have been ghosted on by a lot of big tech companies. And so these revelations did catalyze a big wave of change for privacy measures in the tech companies, but this impact was not felt equally across the spectrum.
Right. Yeah, I definitely recall at the time that there was a lot of expectation that perhaps there would be some kind of major policy change in the US, that this policy change would be imminent, that we would perhaps see the introduction and passage of legislation that preserves rights to privacy in the face of surveillance and data collection. And in the end, that didn't really end up happening. We've seen it happen in other places, right? We have GDPR in Europe. We don't have an equivalent policy framework here in the United States. And this kind of mapped on to what also ended up happening with public opinion. I mean, Mariel, you probably also remember this, that there was quite a lot of hope among civil liberties activists and privacy activists that Edward Snowden's whistleblowing would sort of mark a sea change in public opinion, that it would really get members of the general public to really care about issues of government surveillance, data collection, and then also protections that may or may not be afforded to them by the private companies that create the technologies that they use every day. But this also didn't really happen as well, right? Civil liberties organizations really latched on to Edward Snowden and the events that followed, but it didn't really end up making as much of a splash in public discourse, or at least not for very long. And I think a refrain that we often hear today, or at least I do in conversations with students, with colleagues, and just sort of out and about, is that, you know, privacy is dead. You know, everyone has my information anyway. The government has my information. The private companies have my information. So what does it matter? I mean, there was a hope that, you know, Edward Snowden's revelations about the Prism program would sort of change that. That was an attitude you were already seeing in the early 2010s. But from my estimation, it just didn't.
And as Michelle was saying, this documentary was, came out about a decade ago. And the reason we proposed it for this series on AI, thanks to AJ and Mark, is that even though this was not the moment when we were talking necessarily about surveillance and AI, this was one of those moments in that trajectory of the computational analysis of personal data. And even though, as you will see, this documentary, or really the Snowden revelations, have to do perhaps mostly with one of the problems of surveillance: where does the government get the data? And in the present day, we start to see, the other problem, like how does AI address the other need, which is who will look at this data? How will this data be analyzed? And the Snowden revelations gave us much more of a purview into the sources of data that the government had. It is still, we're talking about computational analysis of data, and especially data that arises from electronic communications. So it is part of this continuum of AI surveillance, even if the term AI might not feature as prominently in the film itself because of the time that it came out. We also proposed it because of its link to, we see it as a productive film to discuss engineering ethics and professional ethics for engineers.
Yes, that's right. I mean, one kind of fascinating aspect of this story is that Edward Snowden himself wasn't, he didn't hold a high-level position. He was, a contractor, essentially working on a large government project. And so, his actions raise a lot of questions, I think, both for engineers and also for people doing government work about what their moral and ethical responsibilities are. And then if there is something that they're being asked to do in the context of their work, in the context of their technical work, that seems to be wrong, that seems to contravene collectively held values, or even may, you know, be against the law in some way, what ought you to do? And I certainly remember from my experience working in government that, you know, kind of quiet conversations outside the office, you know, with peers, with colleagues. You know, DC is a big, you know, lots of people who live in DC are working in government. This was really the talk of the town. And one of the things that people were talking about was sort of whether or not, you know, going to the press and whistleblowing in this way was the right thing to do, whether it was an effective thing to do. People had a lot of opinions about it, and it really kind of speaks to some of the everyday dilemmas that might come up in, you know, engineering and computer science work, about how one handles that. And in the documentary, I mean, we actually will get to see how this process unfolded. We'll get to learn what Edward Snowden's kind of decision-making process was, and what the consequences of his decisions in terms of bringing this information about an otherwise fully veiled government program to the public.
And the very high price to pay when your country is divided and, you know, part of your country thinks that you acted out of love for your people and in the service of your people, and the other part of your country thinks that you're a traitor, and how that plays out in an individual's life and also in the technopolitics of surveillance in the US and beyond. So with that, we are ready to watch some Citizenfour.
Yeah.